All right, so you need to get moving more, and you've realized you've started to develop a new routine, yet the back pain you used to have is kind of filtering its way back. And now it might not be bad enough that things are getting worse on a daily basis, but it's always there, especially during this trying pandemic time. So we need to kind of label this into two things for us right away, is determining, is this back pain that I'm having a flare-up, or is this kind of an ongoing, what we'll deem as like a chronic issue? We treat those very differently, right? Day to day kind of chronic aches, pains, stiffness and stuff, we need to make sure that we're understanding what is the trajectory of those versus a flare-up where I go to pick something up and I feel something and it's like, whew, right? And I'm like a couple days very gingerly and tenderly moving through certain things. Those need to be considered for each of those. I like to use the term flare-up for this, right? Because as a physio, we've seen a lot of these where people's pain will increase and they'll have to move and function slightly different, but it doesn't necessarily mean they've had a catastrophic injury or damage to their structure in their body. And that's really important because most of us who've had back issues will often be in that flare-up stage where the actual structure of the body doesn't really change, but the body tries to protect itself because it did too much too quickly or it got in a position it did like, etc. Versus those of us who just always wake up every morning with just ache, stiffy things, or try to get moving and the back doesn't feel good, or it feels great with certain exercise and then immediately the morning after exercise it feels awful. So I want to help you give clarity in both of those things as a physical therapist at how to navigate them. One is determining what bias does your body have, and by bias I mean, does it not like bending forward movements as much or rounding of the back, or does it not like extending back or arching movement as the back, right? If you just break up those two things, you'll have a much better idea what movements might aggravate your body versus what movements might not. For example, if you tend to have more issues bending forward or rounding your back, you might have more issues on a daily basis with sitting, right? You have your legs propped up, you're like this, and your butt's tucked under, and you're slightly rounded like that. That might be problematic. So if you have 8 hours a day at the computer, that might mean that you have a flexion bias that you're really not feeling great with that particular thing, but you don't notice it because you're working like crazy until the next day, and it leads to kind of that more chronic, everyday achiness and stiffness and pains like that. Or perhaps a better example on the other side is if you have issues with arching your back, right, or what I'd call extension bias, that might mean that walking is more problematic for you. The reason being, when we walk, we generally stand pretty tall, and most of us tend to tilt into this position as we walk forward, especially if we're going downhill and reaching, right? And walking tends to be a little more problematic for those of us who don't like arching our back as much. So if you're in one of those two camps, it isn't, I have back pain, that's the issue. It could be, these activities bias me towards a more particular movement of my back, and this is what's causing issues along there. So for you, from a physio perspective, it's important to understand, is this a flare-up, or is this an everyday thing that keeps on going, right? Exercise, sleep, nutrition will help all of those things, but you can be more in control and autonomous with this by determining, do I have issues extending or bending forward? Easy way to do that and check is literally 10 times in each direction. Reach down, touch your toes repeatedly, and see, does that increase your symptoms? Or put your hands on your back, extend back 10 times, and see, does that increase your symptoms, right? Those are two ways. If you're symptomatic enough, oftentimes repeated movement of that will elicit those types of symptoms. Now you have a better framework to help you understand which movements might be better or worse. Then, as a physical therapist, we can help guide you through, if we know that either flexion or extension bias, I know that if you're looking to start getting into workouts and do kettlebell swings and deadlifts, that's a higher chance that that might aggravate a more flexion bias or bending forward bias. Versus if you're starting to do a lot of workouts with overhead presses, that tends to bother people more who have extension bias. So now we get to create workouts that give you a better chance to understand what your body's response is to be the next day throughout those things. Now, the caveat to this is if you have a flare-up, everything might feel goofy and problematic at that issue, right? So what we look at for people who have flare-ups, we understand that the inflammatory response is generally 7 to 10 days. I'd argue that during a pandemic, it might be a little bit longer because of the overall systemic stress. So we need to make sure that we're doing movements that feel safe to us and maybe doing holds that are appropriate to get through that. and then slowly easing back into more activity. But right, we have to respect it. With the flare-up, the body needs to go through its natural recovery, right, for about 7 to 14 days and get through that before putting a whole lot of extra onto it. So right, rushing into things too quickly could be problematic for those flare-up stages. So your rules for home are to determine, do I have a flare-up right now and that's what's causing this protection of my back? Or is this an ongoing thing where I'm just not certain of what movements affect my back? From there then, do I have a flexion bias where bending forward or rounding my back tends to be more problematic? Or do I have an extension bias where bending backwards or arching tends to bother my back, right? There's activities for each of those that we can kind of highlight that might be more problematic for one or the other. And then last, if you are in significant flare-up right now, that means that you need to give yourself at least 7 to 14 days, 1 to 2 weeks, to respect the process to let the body go through that and not just rush right back into exercise or working out. So if we had that 7 to 14 days and we need to protect ourselves a little bit and let the body do its thing, then what does that mean for you? The best and most important things you can go to right away is looking at what is your sleep like. Decreased sleep will not allow your body to recover as well. So making sure you get plenty of sleep for there is huge. Right? Making sure your nutrition's on point and being able to make sure you have appropriate meals a day, you're getting enough caloric intake, enough vegetables, enough protein will help that recovery and tissue recovery from that. And then overall, your level of stress is in that time period will be huge too. Increased stress or increased perceived stress does affect the recovery of tissues in your body from trying to protect itself. We've seen that across a host of studies. So those are the 3 ways that you can be proactive from there during a significant flare-up. So that's your general trajectory for the back pain during this time. We want to give you tools to be more autonomous, right? So we can just guide you through rather than you having to go somewhere to get it fixed because you have a better understanding of why this is happening. Back pain is ambiguous, uncertain, and scary. We can give you the tools to help you figure out, how do I understand it better? What are the things I have control over? What best can my healthcare practitioner then help do for me during this time? In this light, you'll have a much better conversation with us as physical therapists or your healthcare practitioners at developing exercise routines, at workout routines, at looking at your nutrition or sleep in ways that will benefit you in the long run for your back pain issues that we will all end up having at some point in our life.